Hello, welcome to the Skeptical program with Robert Pennock, Skepticism as a Scientific Virtue. Robert Pennock is a philosopher of science at Michigan State University, where he is a university distinguished professor. His interests are reflected in the departments in which he holds positions: philosophy, computer science and engineering, and ecology, evolution, and behavior. He studies the intersection of evolutionary biology, cognitive science, and the scientific character. Rob is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a national associate of the National Academies of Sciences, and a former president of the Scientific Honorary Society, Sigma Xi. He will tell us tonight about part of his long-running research project on the scientific virtues, but I won't spoil the fun. Stay tuned. The author of over 100 articles in philosophy, science, and education, his first book, Tower of Babel, The Evidence Against the New Creationism, was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. His most recent book is An Instinct for Truth, Curiosity and the Moral Structure of Science. With a long-time interest in the public understanding of science, Rob was co-founder and president of Michigan Citizens for Science, a public interest organization promoting better science education in Michigan. He and I met back in the 1990s when he was a professor at the University of Texas and embroiled in that state's evolution wars. So he's not new at this business of activism on behalf of science education. We chose him as one of the expert witnesses for the plaintiffs, which were the good guys, in the 2005 intelligent design trial, Kitzmiller versus Dover, where he explained to the judge why intelligent design did not qualify as science. One of the local newspaper columnists referred to him as a serious brainiac. Well, I assure you, he is a serious brainiac, but he's not stuffy about it. Rob, welcome to Skeptical.
Thank you, Jeannie. I'm happy to be here. This is awesome.
Absolutely delighted. Now, I know that you are vacationing in New Hampshire, and I want to compliment you on that lovely New Hampshire, a typical New Hampshire house behind you.
It's a little bit distant. This was actually a photo I took when I was visiting Down House, Charles Darwin's abode. So I'm pretending to be there because we'll be talking about him a bit today.
And because I am your host, after all.
Indeed.
If we were on Zoom, I would say, okay, everybody who recognized that house, raise your hand. And I'll bet there'll be a lot of hands that would be raised. Well, as much as I would love to visit more with you because we really don't see each other often enough, I think we should just get right to work and have you give your talk to us, and then I'll be back to talk with you later. So Rob, take it away.
All right, I will so do so. Okay, just if you could confirm that you're seeing my slides and only my slides.
Yes, we are.
All right, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about science in a moral framework. I'm going to be talking about what I call the scientific virtues. It's part of a project that I've been doing for quite a while. This one actually started probably 25 some years ago. And I'll say a little bit about sort of the general framework about that. But I'm going to narrow down to our favorite virtue, which is skepticism. I'm going to try to make the argument to you that we should think of it as a virtue in a very specific kind of way. So this is part of a general project that I call the Vocational Virtue Project. So really it's looking at what it means for any sort of disciplined practice, something that has a normative structure. And I'm specifically looking in this case on the scientific vocation, but I've also done things on engineering, the engineering vocation, the engineering virtues, medicine and the medical virtues, and so on. So that reflects some of these images that you see here. Down below are a bunch of concepts, some of which we will get to, and others we won't quite get all of them, but I wanted to at least alert you to them because they're part of the normative structure of what we're going to be talking about. I've already mentioned vocation, and I've mentioned virtue. You'll hear a little bit more about that. Veracity, the V term for truth. Verification, the V term for testing. Values, which of course is the overarching notion here, and then verisimilitude, which has to do with similarity and so on. We won't get as much to that, but these are just some of the concepts to be alerted to as we go along. This is sort of a philosophy of science talk, but before I get into those deeper concepts, let me start with just a little story of a party I went to last year. This was an invitation to a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot party. And it was my neighbor down the street, someone who's also a professor. And he and another professor friend of his, many years ago, really about 25 years ago, had a discussion about whether Bigfoot was real or not. And the one said, yes, I think that Bigfoot is real. And I think that evidence is going to be found that that's the case. And the other said, I'm skeptical about that. I don't think that's going to happen. And I'll bet you that it's not going to happen. And they made a bet with each other. And the bet was that within the next 25 years, evidence would be found that Bigfoot exists. And the bet was, if at the end of 25 years, it's been found, that the one person would have to host a party celebrating Bigfoot. And if it wasn't found, the other would have to host a party admitting that that his view was wrong. And 25 years passed last year, and in that time, no evidence of Bigfoot was to be found. And so the one fellow hosted this party. The other fellow could invite anyone that he wanted. So it was a big party. And this was just one of the little statuettes in the backyard. There were Bigfoot pictures and posters and so all over the place. And it was quite a fun party, the Bigfoot party. Now, if you sort of think about this in the normal way you think about this, you might say, look, one of those guys was the skeptic and the other one wasn't. And, we might align ourselves with one or the other. But I don't think that's actually the way we should think about this. I think really what was going on was that both of them had a notion that you would decide this question based upon evidence. And it's just that one of them had the hypothesis that it wasn't going to be found, that Bigfoot wasn't real. And the other one had the hypothesis that Bigfoot did exist and evidence would be found. And they were going to sort of see what happened. Okay. And I'm going to argue that really skepticism is not just the one side who's skeptical, but rather they both are exhibiting this basic value. And I want to sort of see how that works. So here's another way in which people probably initially think about skepticism and skeptics. This is the stereotypical view, right? It's kind of a characteristic feature of skeptical groups, the ones that you're probably members of and so on, that you sort of think of them as having the goal of debunking false claims, right? And Mythbusters is probably our favorite show. And obviously they played this up, wearing their stereotypical lab coats and had a clipboard and a stopwatch and so on. There's actually some reason. I mean, stopwatch is indicative of measurement and taking data on your clipboard. So these are actually meaningful icons and so on, but they're clearly playing this up and so on. And if you're just someone watching the show, probably the thing that you most remember of it, I get to see them on stage too. I mean, they play this up, whether it was on TV or on the big a big stage and so on. You get the idea that they're out there and they're going to take something that people thought was true, right? Some myth, and they're going to bust it. Okay. And the stereotypical view of skepticism in this sense, I think that many people have, is this kind of negative notion that skepticism has this impression maybe of, the obnoxious kid who's just out to prove other people wrong, right? And I can imagine that, some of you probably were like that. I was like that in some ways when I was growing up as well. Partly why one becomes a philosopher, because you like to argue about such things and show something's wrong. But I think that that's kind of misleading about what's really behind this. It's not that skepticism is just about doubt and debunking. It just sort of sounds that way because of the nature of the term and so on. But I think we want to be able to bring in the idea of discovery and delight. Okay. And just using skepticism in its negative debunking sense, I think it misses the positive side of science, right? And really, if you remember the show, the Mythbuster hosts were, of course, gleeful if there was some popular myth that they tested that got busted. But they were equally enthused to discover that something that they expected to fail was confirmed, right? Because really, the core goal of a scientific test is not to debunk it, but to check it, right? That's the idea, to find out what the fact of the matter is, to find out what's true. Okay? And so that's what I want to have us think about here. So if you think of science on the one hand, just in skeptical terms, you might be tempted to use this phrase that Thomas Merton, sociologist of science, came up with. It was part of what he thought of as an element of the ethos of science. He called it organized skepticism, which really puts skepticism front and center. And that's clearly the notion that got picked up on in the early skeptical movement. It's partly in the title here for that very reason. And there's something important about that, and we're going to investigate what that is. But it does still have that association of being skeptical about things. It has doubt built into it. It's organized in some way. Okay, so it's not just any sort of doubt. It's doubt of a certain type. But I think it is still misleading, right? Because it has those negative connotations and doesn't have the positive notion of what we're after, which is what? It's to find those truths, right? To find out what's right, to find out what's real, to satisfy our curiosity. Okay? That's what we're really after. We want to see, boy, I wonder if that's true. And yeah, it is. Or, I guess it wasn't. Okay, you want to do it. And so I've used the phrase that you should think of science as being curiosity systematized, right? And that's what my book is about. It's thinking about how that works. And what I want to do now is sort of focus on one aspect of that that's related to how curiosity connects to skepticism. Okay, and the thesis I'm going to argue for here is that skepticism is really kind of a helping virtue. It's a core element of the scientific process because of the way in which it helps us satisfy curiosity. Now, let me just say a little bit about how I'm going to do this by way of the title of my book, which is an instinct for truth. And that's a phrase that comes from Charles Darwin. It comes from a letter that he wrote, just a personal letter to his friend and colleague, Hooker, where he's reflecting upon what he feels within himself. And I'm going to make use of this longer quote from his letter and really going to unpack that as a way of sort of seeing how this structure works. And here's the part I'm going to have us focus on. He says, I believe there exists and I feel within me an instinct for truth or knowledge or discovery of something of the same nature as the instinct of virtue. And that our having such an instinct is reason enough for scientific researches without any practical results ever ensuing from them. Okay. Now, there's a lot in that very compact sentence, and I'm going to have us look at some particular phrases in turn as we go along, starting with this first one, which is the idea of an instinct for truth. Okay, so Darwin means this in just the way you would expect him to when he's talking about an instinct. Okay, he's talking about this in a biological sense, and part of what Darwin thought about from the very beginning was that it wasn't just the physical body that evolves, but it's also going to be our mental traits. And he writes about this, thinks about it very directly and explicitly, and thinks if his account isn't going to be able to make sense of our mental abilities, then it's not going to really do what it needs to do, right? So he thinks of this as something that ought to be scientifically open to investigation, and he thinks it ought to be something that his account of evolution by natural selection, ought to be able to account for. Okay? And the way that he's going to do it is by saying this is an evolved trait. It's an evolved instinct. And it has that philosophical term in there, this notion of truth. And if you take a look at animals, right, I mean, they have this kind of seeking, right? They want to find out. They have sort of an instinctive curiosity, right? Just look at them. They're going to peer right back at you, especially young ones and so on. And that's something that is part of the story that Darwin told, right? How it could be that evolution by natural selection would give an advantage to organisms that had that type of an instinct, right? And think about it in terms of what you have to do. You're born into the world or hatched into the world or however you come into it, and you've got to figure it out, right? If you can't, you're not going to make it, right? Knowing what is food and what's not food, what's going to be healthful or poisonous and so on. These are important things to be able to successfully survive to the point of being able to reproduce. Of course, that's what you need to do to pass on your genes to the next generation. So this idea of mental traits that allow you to figure out about the world, right, to get some knowledge about your environment, to discover things about nature, we'd better have that, at least in a sufficient form, for the environment that we're in. Okay, and so Darwin gives an account of this with the same elements that apply to the biological case. Right, we have random variations that are heritable, subject to natural selection, and that process, which changes our bodies in relationship to an environment, can also change our other traits, including our mental traits. And this is one that he quite reasonably thinks is going to be selectively advantageous. Okay. Now, there are three philosophical terms in here: truth, knowledge, discovery. And I want to just briefly say a little bit about those so that we know kind of what we're doing. When we're talking about truth, scientific kind of sense here, we're not talking about truth with a capital T, right? This is not God's truth. It's kind of a natural truth. It's true enough, right? In working your way through the world, you don't have to have perfect knowledge of it, but you'd better have good enough knowledge of it. Okay? And that's the notion of truth that we're after here. It's a sufficiently true for your purposes. Okay? In some cases, it might have to be really precise. In other cases, just precise enough. Okay? Knowledge. Okay. Philosophically, if you look at epistemology as a subject area, most of that work is on propositional knowledge, knowing that. It has to do with sentences, propositional sentences, things that could be true or false, and then their relationship to the world and to each other and so on. That's what's called knowing that. But of course, the kind of knowledge that you have in simple organisms before you get to organisms that can speak. It can't be that kind of knowledge, right? So it's got to be a different sort of knowledge. And philosophers have talked about knowing how as being sort of a related but different kind. I think that we're going to have to make some sense of how you get to knowing that. But from an evolutionary point of view, you're going to have to start with knowing how. So the kind of knowledge that organisms need to have is knowing how to get around in the world, knowing how to find food, knowing how to find a mate. Okay? They don't have to speak it, but they've got to be able to do it in practice. Okay? So that's the kind of knowledge that we're talking about at first. Simple knowledge of knowing how to do things. And then discovery, the third term there, this is something that, again, has sort of a simple meaning at first. You've uncovered something, revealed something that wasn't previously known. When you get into philosophy of science and what science does in terms of discovering, that uncovering is more involved. It's not just sort of observing something for the first time, but coming to understand it, to reveal the reasons why it is the case. And again, for the full picture, we're going to have to be able to connect that simple notion to the more sophisticated scientific notion here. But we're not going to go too much into that now. But I just wanted to alert you to some of the complexities in these terms. Darwin was actually pretty sophisticated as he thought about various things, and he read philosophy. So he's quite careful in much of what he writes about these sorts of things. Now, some of my work, I'm just going to mention, is in doing what Darwin really hoped one could do, but thought was never going to be possible, which is to do some of this work experimentally. He thought that the best we would be able to do would be to, through a comparative method, figure out how it is that organisms moved, increased in complexity, arose from lower forms to forms that had more abilities, mental powers that they didn't have before. He thought we could do that with this comparative method by looking at a variety of different sorts of organisms. That's good evidence. That was great. But he said, boy, it sure would be nice if we could have some way of doing this experimentally. Well, now we can. And this is my scientific work, is to take the Darwinian framework and to implement it in a computer system where we can then have artificial organisms that actually evolved by Darwin's law, by the mechanism that he discovered. And what that means is that we're able to do essentially experimental evolution and allow artificial life forms to evolve in artificial environments, but in a real way, so that we can then study that process experimentally. And so my work has been essentially doing what Darwin hoped would be possible to do, seeing how it is you could observe perhaps the evolution from organisms, in this case virtual organisms, that don't have abilities to later in an evolutionary process do have that ability. And I'm specifically interested in kind of the abilities that are part of being intelligent. Okay. And one of my projects is specifically about the evolution of curiosity. So the Alice project, which is going on now, is about using a digital system to investigate how it is that associative learning and inquisitiveness, right, work as results of an evolutionary process. So Darwin would love the fact that we're now able to do experiments to test this. Now, I'm not going to tell you about the specifics of that, but just to sort of say, we're actually able to do what Darwin would have liked in a very direct kind of way with regard to these issues, right? An instinct for truth, knowledge and discovery. All right, but now I want to get to the point that connects this to virtue. This is the normative notion of the concepts there. So this is the second phrase I want to highlight for you, that he thinks of this instinct for truth as something of the same nature as the instinct of virtue. Okay, so he's specifically thinking of moral qualities. And this was also something that he felt he needed to be able to address. He said, if my account of descent with modification is going to be acceptable, it's got to be able to explain complicated things like ourselves and the qualities that we have. And he knew that one of the qualities that he would be most challenged on had to do with our moral sense. Okay. And he spends a good portion of chapters in The Descent of Man writing about how what he called the moral sense could evolve in just the same way as the body evolves, in just the same way that mental traits evolve. In fact, my very first published philosophy of science paper was on moral Darwinism, and was on Darwin's account of how this worked. And basically, it's a very similar kind of picture that you would imagine from what I've said before, that certain types of moral qualities and behaviors would be selectively advantageous, right? Helping behaviors where you're perhaps donating resources to others could return in an indirect way to benefit your genes and so on. He thinks about this in sort of a group selective way. And it's very interesting to look at his account of how he expected this to happen with current work on group selection and the evolution of these sorts of traits. Once again, it's the sort of thing where we're able to investigate this experimentally, and I'll just sort of mention in passing an example of this. But his account is equivalent, right? That you have a selective advantage under certain conditions, as with any other evolutionary trait. Under certain conditions, something will be selectively advantageous and be supported. So this idea that probably is the stereotype of evolution, right? Nature red in tooth and claw, right? A competition of all against all. You know, partly that's true. There are basic competitive things all through nature, but there are also very strong cooperative aspects, especially in social creatures. And that's what he was working on, how it could be that we could, through an evolutionary picture, explain why it is that altruistic behavior and cooperative behavior and sharing behavior is actually evolutionarily selective. And as I mentioned, in our digital system, we're able to do this. So we did some experiments on the evolution of altruistic behavior, where essentially we could test and see how these digital organisms would evolve the ability, the trait, to donate in a way that was just predicted by evolutionary theory. Okay, now I'm going to get to further back into virtue theory. So you sort of see how this connects in a conceptual way. And virtue theory goes really back even further than Aristotle, but Aristotle's a really important point for this. And I want to use his definition about this so that you understand what it means. Because we have, I think, probably colloquial notions of what, virtue is. I think it's often, associated with just sort of sexual notions and so on, but that's not at all the notion that he has. It really has to do with a trait, right? And he thinks of it as a settled disposition of the mind. And it's a mental trait that will be conducive of the emotions that we have and the actions that we take. So you'll notice here that there's not something in that definition that's explicitly ethical, right? We now associate this just with ethics primarily, or morals. But Aristotle thinks about this very broadly. He thinks about this as a normative notion, which will include ethics, but also includes epistemic norms as well, norms having to do with knowledge, and so on. And this is something where he then gives an analysis of how that virtue works in relationship to our broader human ethics. And the key notion here is what he calls the human telos. And telos is just the Greek word for end or goal or purpose. And for Aristotle, virtues are going to be those things that are conducive of actualizing our purpose. And he thought that our human potential was as rational animals, right? We're basically animals, but we're a special kind of animals. We're animals that think, okay? So it's sort of like a genus species notion. Animals is the genus, if you will, and rational is the species. Not exactly parallel to the way that we use the terms, but in that sort of framework. And the idea would be for us to be our best selves, right? We should have the traits that will help us actualize that potential as rational animals. Okay? And what would that lead to? It would lead to eudaimonia, which means flourishing, human flourishing. Sometimes it's translated as happiness, but flourishing is a broader and really a better term for this. And then he analyzes some basic classical virtues that he calls the human cardinal virtues, so prudence, courage, justice, temperance, and that then forms the structure for how he thinks about ethics. How do we learn these things? Well, we learn them from those who have thought about them a lot and who have lived a lot and experienced a lot, those who have practical wisdom, right? This is the wisdom of tested thought. And one of the things that you get out of that is that virtue is going to be a trait that exists in this middle range, right? If you have too much of something, it'll turn from a virtue into a vice. If you have too little of something, it'll turn into a vice in that way too. So this idea of moderation, which is a phrase that, you know, moderation in all things, that sort of comes from an Aristotelian framework. So that's virtue theory, broadly speaking. And my twist on this is to say, let's think about it not in terms of virtues for the human being, but rather virtues for vocations, right? For callings, for something that has a normative structure and so on. And now you just have a parallel set. So the vocational virtue is going to be, for science, something that has to do with the traits, the scientific mindset that relate to the telos of science, which has to do with discovering truths about the natural world, right? And what would flourishing be in this case? Well, it'd be a flourishing research culture. We'd be investigating things and finding things out and so on. In the end, these also then contribute to human flourishing. Science does that. So the ultimate goal, is ultimate telos, is still going to be human flourishing. But here's the way in which science contributes to that. And then there are going to be specific, what I call vocational virtues that contribute to that. And the practice, the methodology of science is something that connects those, right? In order to do this, to have those virtues practiced, here's the way to do it. So scientific methodology comes up with that as well. So this for me is this transition from traditional questions that we had in philosophy of science, which have to do with the nature of theory, the nature of hypothesis and evidence and so on, all very important and basic, to now thinking about those who do it, right? The philosophy of the scientist, and then asking, what kind of character ought I have if I'm to be excellent as a scientist? And Aristotle's notion of virtue really has that connection there to excellence. Being an excellent human being involves having the virtues that will be conducive of that telos. Similarly, right, being a virtuous scientist will be having those character traits, the mindset that will be conducive of the scientific telos and so on. And we have to sort of think of ourselves on this picture as being kind of like instruments, and we're kind of calibrating our instrument, our character, to be better, right? To more approach the ideal. So that's what we're after here. Well, that's kind of a broad philosophical framework, which is how I initially did this, right? As a philosopher, you think about how the logic and all works and so on. But because I also do empirical work, I wanted to see, well, maybe we think about this when we're in our armchairs, but what do scientists themselves actually think? Let's see if we can verify some of this against that. So I'm just very briefly talk about sociology of science project that I did, where we did a national study to interview scientists. So this was a massive study where we had a random sample of scientists picked from peer identified groups of exemplary scientists, so Nobel laureates, fellows of various professional societies, early career matched junior scientists. Overall, we had over 1,100 scientists that we interviewed. Took over 4 years, almost 5 years to do the data collection. The coding of this has continued to take another 4 or 5 years. We're sort of only now at the point of bringing it all together. These were mostly phone interviews because we wanted to get both quantitative and qualitative data. A few people said, I don't have time for that, so they did a paper survey and so on. But we have 500 hours of interviews, and they're all triple transcribed and triple coded and so on. So it's a huge data set and so on. And what did we ask about? Just these sorts of things. What virtues are important for research? Okay. We asked them quantitative questions about that, and I'll show you about that in just a second, but also qualitative ones, like how would you define those? How do they show up? What do they look like? How did you learn them? How were you inspired to do this? Who were your role models? In your field, how do these virtues show up in the actual practice? Have they changed over time, right? Are there current challenges to this? And what about scientific vices, right? Virtues are not alone, they're also possible vices. Well, we asked about those. We asked how you learned them, how you passed them along, and so on. So all the things that sort of relate to the broad normative structure of this. I'll just say a little bit about how we identified the virtues itself. The initial part was just the philosophical theory and the historical background. What would you predict from this? Then I did informal interviews with some small group of scientists with just open-ended questions, followed by a pilot survey where we narrowed down the list to like 25 possible virtues. Here's the start of that list, right? So, how important are these? And we had them sort of rank them. And then we narrowed that down to sort of a top 10. And the full national study with everyone sort of quantitatively asked about those top 10, and then open-ended questions about other ones that might have been missed, and so on. And here's sort of a word cloud about what comes out of that. Honesty and curiosity turn out to be by far the top scorers on this. But you can see some of the other ones here: objectivity, perseverance, patience, and so on. But skepticism, being skeptical, turns out to be one of the really important virtues. Okay? And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, sort of how it is that the virtue of skepticism relates to especially curiosity. Okay. Now, one of the projects that I'm doing now sort of takes this formal structure and the data from this and uses it to try to do what really one would hope to do, teach about it. How do we make ourselves better, right? So this project now, virtue-based education for responsibility and integrity to increase excellence in STEM. I love the acronym there. It takes this framework and we put on workshops that are related to the different virtues for scientists, graduate students, and researchers to sort of show them through their own experience and in kind of a Socratic dialogue how this works and so on. All of that has to do with seeing science as something that is based in values. And this is not always obvious to people because there's some sense in which the stereotype says, science just deals with the facts, right? And, other things deal with values and so on. And in for some questions, that's correct, okay? But not entirely. And the point here is that the core things that make science work for what it does, those involve values too. And that's what these virtues are. So we should, as scientists, and as people who care about science, come to recognize and teach about and put forward these values. And I'm going to be doing that with regard to skepticism. Okay. So now we get to the favorite virtue for this particular conference, the namesake, and so on. And I want to say just a little bit in a high level about some of the forms and some of the reason it's valuable in science. Skepticism goes back even farther than Aristotle and so on. There are kind of two branches in ancient Greek philosophy. I'll just mention the one of Pyrrho of Elis. He's someone who thought about epistemology, thought about knowledge, And as he sort of worked through how that was possible, he thought there's actually no thing that we call knowledge that he thought could be certain. He said everything is uncertain. And his conclusion from that was we just have to accept it, that we're by our nature going to be unable to have knowledge of the sort that we might want. And we should just relax. Okay. And basically, what he tried to do was sort of give an account of what this might look like, and the sort of attitude that goes along with it, that he thought was actually better for just human well-being. So he would never make direct claims himself that were just straightforward statements. He'd always preface any claim with, some qualifying phrase like "it seems" or "it appears to me" or "perhaps" or something, right? And he said that this is actually good for human relations. If we were to all practice like this, we would have a kind of inner peace that he thought would be good for everyone. And his fellow citizens of Ellis agreed with him, and they honored his wisdom, and they made him sort of their head priest. So he's known for that. And as a bonus, they exempted all philosophers from taxation. Yeah. I don't know why they don't do that anymore. That would be great. But that's how it was in that period. And he was influential, broadly speaking, and so on. The other form of skepticism was from the Academy, from Plato's Academy. I'm not going to go into that at the moment, but it actually turns out to be an important, if you look to the early roots of the skeptic movement, there's actually sort of a split that happened early on, and that partially has to do with sort of a difference between which form of skepticism was in play. So let me just say now about some of the specifics, because skepticism, as you just can tell from the term, is a relational term, right? It's skepticism of something. And so it's not just one thing. And one can analyze skepticism in terms of its object. Okay, so probably the most basic notion that people think about is, being skeptical of dogma. Okay, but really it's a little bit broader than that. It's a kind of skepticism that I would say that has to do with any sort of appeal or claim that appeals to special authority. And here's how Thomas Henry Huxley put it. Huxley was the person you will remember as being known as Darwin's bulldog. He was the one who was out promoting evolution publicly. Darwin was more of a recluse. He stayed in his home and did his research and didn't really like to go out and so on. But Huxley was out there sort of making the case publicly for him. And this is one of the things that Huxley said just about what we now recognize as being this kind of skepticism. He says the improver of natural science absolutely refuses to acknowledge authority as such. For him, skepticism is the highest of duties, blind faith, the one unpardonable sin. Okay, so this is for Huxley articulating sort of why it is that skepticism is so important. It's a value, right? It's a duty, right? Duty is an ethical notion there, right? He says someone who's pursuing science, right, has to recognize that as such. Now, he's not just making this up on his own. He's really reflecting what I think of as the essence of what was special about the scientific revolution. And I like to illustrate this with this beautiful hall. This is the marble hall of the Royal Society. Okay, so the Royal Society in London, the official name is the Royal Society of London for the Improving of Natural Knowledge. Right, it's founded in 1660. It's a learned society of what were then called natural philosophers. The term scientist doesn't come up till later, but the idea is we investigate nature and through natural laws and so on. And if you go into their offices today, this is one of their beautiful rooms. And if you look to the archway above that door there, you see the motto of the Royal Society, Nullius in Verba. Okay, and that reflects this core ideal, right? The colloquial translation for this is like, take nobody's word for it. Okay, and that's kind of a skeptical phrase there. You need to show me. Okay, I'm not going to just take it. You need to. Where's the beef? Right. That's basically what this is, the Latin form of where's the beef. Okay, and it expresses this virtue of scientific skepticism. It says, don't just tell me, show me. Right. It actually references lines from this Roman poet Horace. Nullius addictus inuare in verbum magistri, which means I'm not bound to swear allegiance to the words of any master. Okay, so that's the idea, that I'm not going to accept someone's word on something, or any master, any authority, right? One is emancipated from science. Is emancipatory, I would say. Okay, and to be called to science is essentially to say that I'm going to be in opposition fundamentally to any idea of submission to authority, and I'm going to bow only to evidence garnered from nature itself. That's what this expresses, and that's the basis, I would say, of the scientific revolution and the basis of science. Okay. Now, this is the thing that's a little puzzling, because when you get to Darwin, he, at least in one letter, says that he seems that he doesn't agree with this, right? He says, I'm not very skeptical. It's a frame of mind which I believe to be injurious to the progress of science. Now, that's kind of puzzling, right? And when I first read that, I thought, why would he say something like that, and so on? Because when you read other things, you recognize that, in fact, he does practice skepticism in a very specific and important way. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of this. So before I talked about skepticism of dogma and skepticism of others who claim authority, another part of skepticism is skepticism of oneself, right? Because the easiest people to fool are ourselves. So you have to be skeptical of what you want to have happen or want to be true, and act through methods and so on to let the evidence tell you what is true, rather than what you'd like to be true, what your self preference would be. And that's what Darwin does. He says, I've steadily endeavored to keep my mind free so as to give up any hypothesis, however much beloved, right? And he says, and I can't resist forming one in every subject, right? He naturally is trying to figure things out. But to be willing to give it up, however much beloved, as soon as facts are shown to be opposed to it. Okay, that's to say, as soon as the evidence says they don't fit with my hypothesis, so much for the hypothesis, got to give it up. It says, indeed, I've had no choice but to act in this matter, for with the exception of the coral reefs, this is one of his early hypotheses about that particular geological structure. He says, I can't remember a single first formed hypothesis which had not after a time to be given up or greatly modified. So I would say here, in reflecting upon his own mindset, in fact, he is expressing this basic idea of skepticism, in this case, skepticism to himself. Okay. Now, I just want to give you one example of how he does this in practice. Right? So this is a photograph of Darwin's study at Down House, as it would have looked at the time that he was working there. And you can see he's got a ton of books. And if you look down further, a lot of notebooks too. And Darwin was very, very systematic about the way that he did his work. And he knew that he needed to check himself against the facts. And even though he had this very cool idea, he quite intentionally, if there was any fact that came along in his reading or conversations or correspondence with people that went against his view, he would write it down to make sure that he would then address it and figure out, well, is there an answer to this? Because he knew that otherwise you might just ignore it. So he's really careful to look for things that might go against what he held. And this is just an example of one of his books. He took notes in the books as he was reading them, in addition to sheets of paper and so on. This is actually a copy of Charles Lyell's one of his books. Lyell was a geologist who talked about principles of geology and slow transitions of the form of the earth, but he wrote about things broadly. And here's one thing that Darwin's noted, okay, a passage in one of his books. This is Lyell saying that the variation in biological types, which any given kind of change can produce, may usually be affected in a brief period of time, after which no further deviation can be obtained by continuing to alter the circumstances, that is to say, the environment, though ever so gradually. Indefinite divergence, either in the way of improvement or deterioration, being prevented, and the least possible excess beyond the defined limits being fatal to the existence of the individual. So Lyell is saying organisms can't vary and change. They're going to be in fixed limits. Okay, so Darwin, you can see he's underlined this, right? And he's written in the margin. It's a little hard to see here, but this is what he says. If this were true, adios theory. Okay. So he's recognizing this is going to be a challenge that I'm going to have to confront. And if he's right about this, my theory goes out the window. Okay. So that, I would say, is, the most basic kind of skepticism towards self, right? Even though he loves this account, this theory that he's got, he's going to have to give it up, and he recognizes as such if the evidence goes against it. He can't just accept it because he hopes that it's true. Now, here's something else he says, though, that lets me say that he's not really rejecting skepticism, is that he recognizes that it's something that has to be done in moderation. And this is again from a letter. He says, good deal of skepticism in a scientific person is advisable to avoid much loss of time. Okay, but I've met with not a few who I feel sure have often thus been deterred from experiments or observations which should have proved directly or indirectly serviceable. So what's he saying here? He's pointing to the extremes. He says, you need to have some skepticism. That's a good thing, but you can't have too much, because if you do, you might give up too easily, right? It might deter you from doing an experiment or doing additional observations, okay, which could have actually been useful. So basically, his notion of skepticism here is exactly what Aristotle would have recommended to us. It's skepticism in moderation, right? Too much skepticism, that's a vice. Too little skepticism, that's a vice. Skepticism, properly understood, is this middle virtuous position, which fits with virtue theory broadly. And I'd say Darwin really did recognize that. And here's just one final thing I'll mention with regard to how he viewed his own account. He says, let me add, I fully admit that there are very many difficulties not satisfactorily explained by my theory of descent with modification. Okay? He's been keeping track of them, right? He knows he doesn't have answers to everything. But he says, I cannot possibly believe that a false theory would explain so many classes of fact as I think it certainly does explain. Okay? That's to say, there's all this evidence for it because it accounts for this whole range. The Origin of Species is really just going through that very systematically. And he says, on these grounds, I drop my anchor and believe that the difficulties, the still unresolved questions, will slowly disappear. Okay. And that's the sense of being subservient to the evidence, but not just giving up, right? Not just being skeptical to say that we can't accept anything as true. He actually thinks that there's the weight of evidence in favor of what he's put forward. And there's still things to be worked out for sure. But he thinks that the evidence is strong enough to weigh anchor on this. To drop anchor on this. So that's right? He's using skepticism in just the way that you want to have to support something through evidence. Okay. So this is the way that I think we should put it, right? You think of skepticism as being like the salt of science. Okay. So when you recommend a skeptical or critical attitude towards something, this is a phrase that you often use, right? You should take something with a grain of salt. Okay. And that expression actually goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks as well, and specifically to Pliny the Elder, right, who wrote this book called Naturalis Historia. And in that book, he describes what he says is a traditional recipe for an antidote to poison. He says, you take a couple of dried walnuts, a couple of figs, you take 20 rue leaves, and you pour them out and pound them all together, and you add a proverbial grain of salt. Okay? You take a dose of this mixture, he says, and that will be, quote, proof against all poisons for the day. Okay? So the figurative meaning that we have, right, that developed in terms of, taking like biblical claims, scriptural commentators take that with skepticism. He says that you do that in order to avoid error, right? That's what taking it with a grain of salt is. It's being sufficiently skeptical to avoid that sort of error. And so that's what skepticism is, right? A pinch of skeptical salt helps one avoid taking dangerous false claims in, right? It keeps those at bay. And skeptical tests really are the proof against such poisons. That's what testing is, right? A test of something is similar to taste, right? Test and taste have the same etymology here. It's something that allows us to check something against the evidence of experience. Okay? And in that sense, skepticism is the salt of science, right? It's an essential ingredient, but must be applied in moderation. I just want to briefly thank some of my team, folks from the Involving Intelligence Project, folks from the Scientific Virtues Survey and the Verities Project. But I want to just end with one thing from that party. Later on in the party, this creature showed up in the garage, looking very much like Bigfoot. And it might just be that it was 25 years too late. Of course, maybe not. I'm skeptical, and I think you are too. And with that, I thank you.
Well, you realize, of course, you've given everybody watching the idea for a great summer party, which is a Bigfoot party where you will wait to see if Bigfoot shows up. I mean, in general, we're easy suckers for a good excuse for a party. So,
It was a great party, I've got to say.
It was clearly inspiring, but I had never heard that quote that you gave from Darwin, and I've read a lot of Darwin, but I had missed that one about dropping the anchor, that letter. I think it was to Asa Gray, but that is just that. For those of people who are watching, we're not quite the Darwin fans that you or I were. That is where he was talking about how, evolution by natural selection doesn't explain everything, but man, it just explains so much that we're just going to go with it. And that just so perfectly encapsulates how, we think of building theory. A theory doesn't have to explain everything about the issue that you're dealing with, but as long as it explains everything else better than anything else. I mean, that basically was a point that you made in Kitzmiller. And I would encourage anybody to read Rob's transcript on Kitzmiller for his when he was on the stand, because it is really you'll learn a lot of science, you'll learn a lot of philosophy. But that quote from Darwin, of course, was very much related to your points about moderation in skepticism as well. And that made me think. I mean, I can totally understand why you'd want to have moderation and skepticism. Clearly, too much skepticism, and you stop looking for stuff that might be there. There might be a Bigfoot. Too little skepticism. About some things we can feel we've looked long enough. But anyway, that's another story. Too little skepticism. And that certainly has its problems as well. You may
being gullible, right?
Yeah, that's right. You may spend too much time on a project that there's a pony there somewhere. There's no pony. Time to give up. But I don't understand why that same rationale would work for virtues, which is something else you brought up. Why why would you have moderation and virtues? I can totally understand why you would, you kind of don't want people sliding down the less virtuous side of things, because they're in our problems for society. But what's wrong with having really, median plus virtuous people? Why? How can too much
Both
virtue be a
virtues,
bad
right?
thing? Huh?
So, so this actually is part of Aristotle's analysis of what makes something virtuous and what virtue is, right? So I'll just use his classical example of this, which is courage, right? So that's one of the general human virtues. And he says, well, just think about that quality and how it works, right? If you have too much of that quality, what is that? That's being brash, right? That's being foolhardy. That's the the soldier who rushes in, against
Yeah.
all odds with no hope, right? That's not a brave thing to do. That's not courageous. That's just stupid, right? And similar, if you have too little of it, that's the coward. Okay.
Mhm.
So the idea here is both excess and deficiency turn a virtue into a vice. Okay.
Mhm.
Um, and really, you can go through other virtues as well and find that same kind of structure. Now, it doesn't tell you exactly where the balance is. And of course, that's what a lot of ethical work is about, right? How do you
Mhm.
find that right balance? And
Mhm.
I think we have that same work to do for skepticism, right? We,
Mhm.
we if we're skeptics about everything, you
Mhm.
don't get anything, right?
Mhm.
Whereas if you don't have anything at all, then you get the opposite. So it's a matter of finding that right balance of skepticism so that it serves the purpose, which is finding out what's true, right? It's going to serve curiosity if it's done right. And that's the value. I think that's why it was thought as being so central, because
Mhm.
it's essentially a check upon ourselves, right? It's a check to say, don't accept something too quickly. Don't accept what you just want to have true. You've got to
Mhm.
be so skeptical of all these sorts of things. And that's going to provide the thing against um, uh, going wrong, right? False positives or false negatives, right? You need to find the balance.
Mhm. Yeah, good way to think about it. I appreciate that. You mentioned that you had your digital organisms evolution project, and just at the end you showed a picture of Lenski's crew, with which I think some of the skeptics may be more familiar with the real organism evolution project that Lenski has run for so long
With E.
with
coli.
with E. coli, and placing different strains on different in different selective pressures. But can you just talk a little bit more about the digital evolution project, just so people get an idea of some of the breadth of the work that you've done with this issue?
So I'll mention it just in relationship to this particular notion here, uh, just because it's such a powerful technology. You can do a lot with it, but the basic idea is that if you understand what Darwin discovered, right? If you understand Darwin's, what I say we should just call Darwin's law, right? I've been
Mhm.
arguing for this. We would just call it Darwin's law. It used to be called that. We should just continue to call it that. If you understand how it works in the level of abstraction that he meant it, then it shouldn't matter. In fact, it doesn't matter what the particular um, element is that instantiates it. Okay,
Mhm.
it's DNA, it's RNA. If we're in some other Alpha Centauri and it happens to have a different molecular basis, that's fine too, as long as it can, randomly vary and have information that's heritable and be subject to natural selection. Yeah, anything will do, right? Okay. Similarly, you can have those same elements, random variation, heritable, natural selection, in a digital environment. It's just code. It's just code, right? DNA is code. It has information there that's structured in a certain way. The same thing with these digital organisms. It's just in this case computer code in a silica environment, right, rather than a DNA in a out in the world environment. But it follows exactly the same causal processes. And what that means is you can evolve things not by um, not by design, right? But by the regular evolutionary processes that happen in nature, and watch it happen. Okay, and then once you know how to do that, then you can do experiments. All right, so the experiments that we've been doing on this have to do with setting up conditions, and you can do this very precisely now. You can set up conditions so the environment can be, measured, replicated. You can do way more replications way faster with this sort of approach. And we do it now to investigate things like use of information from the environment, evolution of memory, or in this case, evolution of curiosity, right? Being inquisitive about the world in a way that might be selectively advantageous. And those experiments are just basic evolutionary experiments. You mentioned Rich, who's my colleague on these. He was at one point ready to just put his E. coli aside because this is much faster.
That's
Same
true.
thing. You can go way faster. I mean, he's got 70,000 generations, but we can get millions of generations and so on. So it's a kind of system now that's just very powerful. And as I said, we've been able to do it for investigating things like the evolution of altruistic behavior and so on. And now starting to do things for the evolution of curiosity. So I think, we can do what Darwin wanted, and we're seeing, of course, that he was right as usual.
Very cool stuff. All right, we have some questions from people who have been watching. Howard asks, doesn't truth too easily include supernatural phenomena, while data is easier to identify as natural? One can then say that devotion to data integrity defines the true scientist.
So this makes it seem as though there's some contrast between the two, and I don't think there is. I mean, for something to be scientific data, it requires that it fulfill certain properties, right? It'd be great if we could have, a metaphysical telescope, right? Something that can let us peer into the heavens and not just the astronomical heavens, but into heaven itself, right? If you could have such a thing, then you could maybe do an experiment, do an observation. Supernatural phenomena don't let you do that. So there isn't data in the sense that's needed. And so that turns out to be something that just disqualifies that from the realm. There's not a way in which we can use our digital organisms or E. coli or anything else to get data of that sort. And that's why it was called natural philosophy. That's why science started in that way. We're able to find things about nature, and the other stuff, if you believe it for other reasons, that's a separate kind of issue.
Is there another question? Jason Bush asks, speaking of Darwin, curiosity gave us advances that helped thwart our natural predators. But now, like the movie illustrates, with no natural predator, thinning the herd, are we entering idiocracy? There was a movie called Idiocracy, for those of you who may not be aware of it.
I have not seen that one.
I haven't either, but I know
so I can't speak to the way that they do. It is interesting to see that the way that popular culture makes use of evolution. It's mostly in the way of a very simplistic survival of the fittest, and the Darwinian all against all, and they very often draw a moral conclusion about that we should be doing this and so on, which everyone, philosophers and I think biologists as well, say is a leap that doesn't go through. So I don't know about this particular movie as to whether they make that same sort of fallacious error and so on. I think that maybe you're talking things more along the lines of, hey, we're the apex predator, and in that case, we don't have anyone that's thinning our herd. But of course, that's not the case. There are lots of ways in which our herd is thinned. You only need to follow the annual Darwin Awards to know of such cases of foolish folks who idiotically put themselves in harm's way. Most recently, we had cases with the pandemic and so on. So it is true that we can multiply way beyond perhaps our means, and that's a threat. Hopefully, our mental evolution will allow us to think ahead and maybe change our behaviors in that kind of way. We certainly shouldn't wait for a biological evolution to do it. We should use cultural evolution to our advantage.
Yeah, I think there's a common mistake in the public, which would be, I guess, a whole skep talk in and of itself someday. But the idea that evolution is no longer working on modern industrial populations like ours, and that just simply is not true.
Right.
There's, it's just working differently than it did when you had to teach the kids, watch out for the saber tooth. That's not a watch out for the cars. there's a lot of predators out there.
That's right.
Jay Diamond asks, why do we seem to be so far away and sometimes getting farther away from human potential of being rational animals? Hey, that's pretty dark.
that is, I don't think that's true. I think we really are getting better in just all sorts of ways. I mean, the kinds of advances that we make, I think we're not getting further away from that. I think we're regularly improving it. But of course, we're also there are lots of ways in which we're not, and some of those are dangerous ways. So I think that's probably what you're rightly pointing out. I think science can help. I think a scientific mindset, I think a skeptical mindset, all these sorts of things can make us better at this. We have mental abilities that have evolved, but we still have other ones that have a ways to go. So we have to resist some of our instincts and advance others if we're going to do this well.
I think there's one last question. Why do skeptics ignore the work of Daniel Kahneman?
Do they?
That's new to me, but yeah. Unfortunately, questions cannot be two-way at this point.
I mean, it's the sort of thing where, I mean, I've certainly heard skeptical talks that have talked about this, and the issue really has to do with limitations and heuristics that we use that are not conducive to finding out truths about the world and so on. So it's definitely an issue. Science is hard. Math is harder. And so on. So it's not something that just comes easily. My thesis here is that we're all biologically endowed with sort of the basic wherewithal to be able to do these sorts of things. All of our ancestors did it, right? All of our ancestors were successful. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. I mean, the ones that are in our direct line and so on. And I think curiosity as one of these basic traits, you just see it, and it doesn't mean that you know how to use it beyond sort of the basic biological notion. That's where science comes in. That's where education comes in, right? We then refine that biological notion through methodology, through logic, and so on. And the natural heuristics that we might use that pointed out, okay, those are not good enough in current situations, but they actually probably were good enough in the situations that they evolved in, right? And that's the idea about evolution as producing things that are sufficient for the needs. It doesn't have to be optimal to be evolutionarily advantageous. And so I think that's the important point here. We're not perfect. We never will be, but hopefully we're good enough for our challenges.
I always taught my students that it's not survival of the fittest. It's survival and reproduction of the fit enough.
That's right.
Can you talk about your role in Kitzmiller versus Dover, please?
I'll just sort of mention one thing. I mean, there's a lot of that's a whole separate talk and so on, and it's great. We're going to be coming up in an anniversary on this soon.
20 years. Jeez.
Yeah, so this will be great. And at that point, I think I'll probably write something about that as a reflective piece. I now have a column in American Scientist magazine, and I've already sort of thought ahead. Okay, I'm going to have to do something for the Kitzmiller case.
But I mean, just very briefly though, what we needed you to do is distinguish between science and religion. That is something that we asked almost all of our expert witnesses to do, including the theologian, the historian, the scientist, the philosopher, because that was key to the case. Intelligent design had to be shown as being a fundamentally religious idea and not a successful scientific endeavor at all. And your work was very clear about how you and you actually referred to it briefly in your talk today. You must restrict yourself to material causes. If you could work on that just a little,
So materialist in the sense of natural causes, right? These are things that are part of natural cause-effect relationships. It's just those are the natural laws that we're able to investigate. It's part of how scientific methodology works, and so that question before about the paranormal and so on. That's when you start going beyond. It actually becomes kind of tricky, the boundary there, because some of the things that we talk about as being paranormal, right, don't necessarily mean supernatural, right? It just means sort of like on the edge, and we don't quite know what it is. I mean, it's something that maybe there was some weird wave that would allow for ESP and so on. If you sort of posit it in that kind of way, then you'd say if we're positing that it could follow a natural law, then potentially you could investigate it in that type of way and then show that it doesn't work, and so on. So I'd say that's the way in which you kind of do it. But once you start doing things that just toss out natural law and talk about miraculous interventions and so on, then you're out of the realm of something that we can test and check and so on. So, and I think that has to do here with partly this virtuous notion. We're going to follow as scientists what we can get evidence for, right? We're not going to accept something on authority. We have to focus only on something that we could then test and check.
And testing, of course, is essential. Testing is essential. Yeah. If you can't test it, and notice I didn't say the word experiment, but if you can't test it, then you can't say much about it scientifically. And to test it, you need the evidence. So all of those things have to come together. I would love to talk with you more, but we've already gone over, and thank goodness it's the lunchtime, so that people hopefully are, having their sandwiches as they watch us. But we'll have to let our people go. Rob, this has been a lot of fun. Maybe we'll get you back to some future Skeptical, and you can tell us more about your very interesting work. Thank you for being here, and thank all of you for watching. Stay tuned for the rest of this afternoon's Skeptical. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.